Okay, this video is to cover section 4.8. I'm going to start with number 1. Now we're going to solve for the variable, whether it be an x, a y, I'm not sure. But this very first one, it's the letter x. So if we write the equation out, x plus, and then we have 3 over 7 equals negative 3 over 7. So now the goal is to get the letter on one side of the equation and the numbers on the opposite side. So you can tell right here, this here needs to be moved over. Now, if it's a positive on one side, it's going to be a negative on the other side because we've learned the process of subtracting it out so it zeroes out, and what you do to one side, you must do to the other. So when we move it over, it's going to be the opposite. So I'm just going to rewrite my negative 3 over 7. Now that becomes a minus 3 over 7. So now we have two fractions that we are subtracting. So the first thing I'm going to look at and say, well, are they like fractions? Do they have the same denominator? This does. So I can just go ahead and rewrite it as negative 3 minus 3 all over 7. Now we're going to apply that rule we've learned. We just change this to a plus and make this the opposite sign when we're dealing with integers being negatives and positives. And then when we go ahead, and the rule is if the signs are the same, add and keep the sign. So this would be negative 6 over 7. And that is in simplest form. We can't reduce that fraction down any further. All right, so let's go ahead and try number 2. So number 2, we have y minus, and there's 17 over 23, and that's equal to negative 7 over 23. Okay, it's the same exact process. We can see that we need to take this and move it over to this side. So we're going to have to add it so it zeroes out, and what you do to one side, you must do to the other. So you'll add it to this side. So if I rewrite this, it would be y equals, now we're going to just rewrite what we didn't use, which is the negative 7 over 23. And then moving that fraction over, it becomes a positive on the side, 17 over 23. Now, luckily, you can see we have like fractions, so there's not a whole lot of work. We can just go ahead and rewrite it. We don't have to worry about lowest common denominator. So if I rewrite it as one fraction, it's going to be negative 7 plus 17 over 23. Signs are the opposite. You subtract, take the sign of the larger number. I'm just going to write it over here. So that would be 10. Oops, let me just write underneath. Be consistent. Y equals 10 over 23. Now we can't reduce that down any further, so that would be your final answer. All right, now let's move on to number 3. Now number 3, we have 6x minus 1 over 7 minus 5x. Now we have our equal sign, and it's 1 over 7 plus 3 over 7. Now I'm going to look at both the left and the right side of the equation. Before I start moving things around, I'm going to look and say, can I combine anything? And when we say combine, remember that's, can we add or subtract anything that's like, whether it be like terms or whether it be like fractions. So thinking of this, you can see over here on the left side, we can combine these two right here by subtracting them because they both have the variable x. Going to the right side of the equation, we can see that these two have the same denominator, so we can combine those. So staying over to the left side, if I take 6x minus 5x, I'll end up with an answer of 1x. And I'm just going to rewrite the 1 over 7. I haven't used that yet. If I go over to the right side, I can see that this becomes 1 plus 3 over 7, that fraction. So instead of writing that, I'm just going to go ahead and perform the operation, which is adding it. So you would end up with 4 over 7. Now it looks a lot better than our original equation, which was right here. So we just simplified as much as we could by combining like terms or like fractions by adding and subtracting those. Now you can see that, and remember, anytime we have 1 times x, it's written like this or it's written like this, no matter what, the answer is still just x. So when we go ahead and we're going to take this fraction and move it over to this side of the equation, you can see it's plus or minus, so it's going to be a plus over here because we're going to plus 1 over 7 to zero it out. And what you do to one side, you do to the other. So when we rewrite it, I don't have to rewrite 1x because we know that's just x. I'm going to rewrite my 4 over 7. And again, on this side, it's plus 1 over 7. So again, we have like fractions. They have the same denominator. So all we need to do is add the 1 to the 4. And our answer is 5 over 7. And that is in simplest terms. All right, let's move on to number 4. Now, number 4 is negative 1 over 9, and that's equal to x minus 5 over 6. So we have the variable on the right side this time, and that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're x on the left or the right. Just make sure that when you decide which side it's going to be on, that it's the letter alone and the numbers on the opposite side. So you can see this here, we're going to need to move over to this side of the equation. So if it's a minus 5 over 6, we're going to add it to get it to zero out. So it means we'll have to add it to this side. So when we rewrite it, just make sure we include that negative 1 over 9. We're going to add it to the 5 over 6, and that equals 2x, because we moved that fraction over to the left. And I'll just make sure I continue to make that with a red x. A red equal sign. Alrighty, now all we have to do is handle the fraction on the left side. But wait a minute, we have some work to do because these are not the same denominator. So we have to find the lowest common denominator. So if I have 6 and I have 9. So if I start going through the process, if we have 6 times 1 is 6, 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 3 is 18, 6 times 4 is 24. If we start going through the process with 9, here's 9 times 1, 9 times 2, 9 times 3. But you can see that 18 is the lowest common multiple, lowest common denominator. So it's 18. All right, so I'm going to set up my fractions. We have 1 over 9. We know that denominator is 18, and we have 5 over 6. Now these are coming up with our equivalents. So we know that 3 times, let me change my color. So we know that 3 times 6 is 18. So 3 times 5 is 15. And then we know that 2 times 9 is 18. So 2 times 1 is 2. Now we have our equivalent fractions. So I'm going to use those over here. Don't forget your negative because originally there's a negative. So negative 2 over 18. And we're going to add that to 15 over 18. And that's all equal to x. All right, so now we can see that they have the same denominator. So we're going to write it as one fraction as negative 2 plus 15 over 18. And that is equal to x. Now the signs are opposite. We subtract, take the sign of the larger number, which is positive 13 over 18. And that cannot be simplified any further. So that is your final answer. All right, let's move over to number 5. Number 5, it's a different strategy. We have 8x equals 7. How do we get the 8 off of that x since it's attached by multiplication? Well, we're just going to divide it out by 8. That way it will divide out to 1, and we know 1 times x is just x. And what you do to one side, you must do to the other. So we divide it by 8. So that answer is just simply x equals 7/8. You can't reduce it down any further. All right, let's move over to number 6. Now number 6 is -10, and that's equal to 2/7x. So the same concept. Previous problem we had 8 attached to the x. This time we have a fraction attached to it. So if I just show you this to the side, if we take 2/7, we multiply it by its reciprocal, 7/2, you can see that when we simplify this, this will divide out the 1's, and this will divide out the 1's. So your answer is just 1/1, which equals 1. So that's what we're going to do to this side of the equation. We're just going to multiply it by its reciprocal. And that will divide out 2 1's. These were all reduced to 1's. And you're just left with x on one side of the equation. But what you do on one side of the equation, you must do to the other. So you would have -10 times the 7/2. And that's equal to x. So remember, 10/1 is how we write a whole number as a fraction. Just like that. So if I write -10/1 times 7/2, and that's all equal to x. Now I'm going to write it as one fraction. Oops, I didn't mean to reduce the size. So we're going to write it as don't mean to mess with your eyes. So we're going to write it as -10 times 7 all over 1 times 2. And that's equal to x. All right, so I'm going to start thinking, is there anything I can factor out so I can reduce this before I multiply it? And you can see we can get a 2 times 5 out of the 10. So I'm going to rewrite that. So -2 times 5 times 2 times 5 times 7 all over 1 times 2. And you can see these divide out to 1's. Now if I just multiply across, you end up with 35/1 equals x. And we know that's simply just x equals 35. And that's your final answer. All right, so see if I can squeeze one more problem in on this video, and then we'll move over to a part 2. So we have number 7, and this is a -4m equals -8/11. So you can see the 4 attached to the m. Again, if we divide out by 4, now I guess the easiest way to think of that, since we have a fraction on the other side, you could also multiply it by its reciprocal. And remember, 4/1 is how we express a whole fraction, so the reciprocal would be 1/4. So if I multiply this by 1/4, you can see, and again, this is 4/1, you can see how these divide out to 1's, just all 1's. And then what you do to one side, you must do to the other. So we would have m, get the color correct, m equals, and then it would be the -8/11. And then we do the same thing to this side, 1/4. Now, the only thing that doesn't work with this, if you notice on this side, we had a negative. So I would need a -1/4, because remember, a negative times a negative will give you the positive answer. So since it's a negative times a negative, we need to make sure we have the negative on this side also. Now, I'm going to multiply that out. So 8 times 1, that'll give me a +8. And on the bottom, I'll end up with a, but before I multiply that out, how about if we take that -8 and factor out a 2 times 4 times -1. And then on the bottom, it would just be 11 times 4. So that way, these divide out. And then our final answer will be a +2 over 11. And that's your final answer.